Hello there, it's Richard from Glacier here, and today I'm going to talk about hobby failing. This is the Glacier King shown in the picture from my Horde's army. Well, this isn't my model, this is the recommended painting image that comes with a box that you can find online. So this gargantuan model is, as you might expect, rather big. And I was excited to get it because I've got an airbrush, and it feels like painting big things is what you want to do with an airbrush. So the Privateer Press models are a bit different from Games Workshop ones, if that's what you're used to, and so it's taken me a little while to adapt to putting them together. So I'm sure we'll come across a few areas where there's a bit of hobby failing going on, and maybe I can help you not to make the same mistakes I did. Um, so the gargantuan Glacier King is obviously quite cold and frosty, and that's all in his rules. So his rules have aspects such as snowfall and big frosty fists, and he can freeze models, and his animus, which is one of his powers, is to create frozen ground. So clearly he's a cold guy, and that needs to be reflected in the way that he's painted. Um, and this text that I've found to describe him shows that he's got these big bone yellow teeth. So we want him to be blue, and we want some bone in there. He's got bones hanging off his belt. But the way that the Privateer Press model has been painted, I felt was a bit too blue, and so I wanted to change this a little bit. Um, so here's my built model, and there's a reference model in front there just to give you an idea of his size. So he is absolutely ginormous. He's about 4 normal models high, and so that's a challenge in itself. Trying to get all the arms attached are quite large. I did consider painting it separately and then attaching it, but just the sheer amount of green stuff you need to connect the bits together just seemed to make it impractical, that you could paint it all nicely and then really have problems gluing the parts in the right place. If you're trying to work out which areas are in shadow, that makes it quite hard if the parts of the model aren't already in place. So I've got a little zoom in just to show the amount of green stuff that had to go in to plug the gaps. The whole back crystal section slotted in, and so did the shoulder crystals, and as did some of the icicle crystals hanging under the arms. So and all around the belts there were large gaps, and trying to make the green stuff smooth up near those crystals, it's supposed to be snow on the shoulders, was really quite a challenge and took a long time. So finally I'd got it all glued together, and so excited I got the airbrush out. I did some zenithal highlighting with my different primers. So I got the black primer from underneath and my grey primer all over, and then I gave it a going over with some white from above to pick out the appropriate shadows. Now it's such a big model, in some ways it casts its own shadows. I mean, obviously by the time this thing becomes real life size, you don't need to worry about the shadowing at all. The model would make its own. So it's a bit of a challenge to work out which bits need shadow, because it's casting its own. And I may need to think about changing the lighting around my desk for such big models, because the shadows cast by those crystals onto the snow are really quite strong. Anyway, so I had primed it and highlighted it, and then I used the Formula P3 paint, the Trollbud base, and thinned it down to get it through the airbrush, and used that all over the body. And then for the crystals I used the Vallejo Model Air Blue to try and pull out a different colour blue for these shards, and again I needed to thin it a little bit, but the airbrush paints go on fine. So a little bit of foreshadowing, you might be able to see there's a slightly shiny tip to one of his teeth, and that provides a hint at one of the problems. I've missed a step in my model preparation. So I started my airbrushing, and this is what happened outside my house. The snow came down. I thought, oh, it was a good portent that clearly the weather was paying attention to the fact that the Glacier King was. So I worked on the snow. So I wasn't really happy with the blue that I'd used. It seemed a bit too similar to the other blue, and also I was worried about trying to pull out the white, the snow in between the crystals. So I masked off the body, and this was really as much a challenge and a test for me to work out the best way to mask off a model. So I used a plastic bag and the special masking tape that doesn't remove paint. And sprayed the top of the model all white to pull out the snow, and then my idea was then I was going to go and wash those crystals over the white instead. At this point I've also done a whole wash with game colour blue over the skin to pull out all the bumps and cracks, the nooks and crannies, which really gives extra depth to the body. And there are lots of nooks and crannies all around the neck there, where the veins all pop out, the tendons in the neck. So there's lots of room for doing washing. And I've got the game colour washes that I've been using on that, and you do use rather a lot on such a big model. But again, if I zoom in on the face, you can see that I'm really struggling with these teeth. The teeth, most of the model here is plastic or resin, but the teeth are metal, and there are a few metal bits, and the paint just keeps chipping off these teeth. So you can see here that I've actually primed it again, put some more, painted on some undercoat to try and stop the paint peeling off. But after trying to work at this for a few times, the paint kept on peeling off. I realised that if I rubbed any section of the model hard at all, the paint just came off. So this shows you the image from the front after I've spent a few evenings having a go at just essentially finding the areas, if I rub, where does the paint come off. So I started with all the metal bits, and then all the bits on the back. I hoped maybe it would just be those big crystals, but it ended up being pretty much all his body at the front and the back. So that was really quite depressing after spending a fair amount of time getting the model into a good base state to paint. All the paint has come off, and spending a couple of evenings trying to peel it off and scrape it off wasn't that much fun. You can see actually the fur of the bear, the paint seems to have stayed on fine, and there were certainly some areas that didn't have problems. But that was what I was left with. So you can see the metal finger joints, the small finger, that they were metal additions, and the paint had peeled off those as well. So what did we learn? Well, I knew this already, most of you will know this, but you get lazy with GW models. Often you don't need to wash them, and I'd got so excited I got it all together, and I had a chance to airbrush the model. I wanted to get it painted. So lesson number 1, wash that model thoroughly in warm soapy water. Now I did actually do this once I'd scraped off most of the paint, but I've still had problems with some areas. There were the teeth, and there were various bits that I managed to remove. Some of the bone and things on the belt I took off, and I've washed them thoroughly, but the the paint just really does not want to adhere to some of this stuff. It's very shiny and smooth bare metal. So I ended up having two varnish sections. So I did have matte and gloss varnish. So I've been using the varnish to help attach to that that bare metal, and then painting over the top of the varnish, and then varnishing again to just give it a bit of protection. So I think I used matte varnish on the bare metal to help stick, and then after I've got some paint on there, then I put gloss varnish over the top of that to help protect it. So that seems to be working pretty well so far. There are still the odd bits. Unfortunately, these are all the protruding bits, and I guess they use the metal because it's more robust. It's less likely to break or snap than the plastic, but it's really likely to chip. So I'm going to have to be very careful about making sure that I've varnished those bits so the paint job isn't ruined down the line. The other thing, of course, is when this happens, you just have to pick yourself up and carry on, really. You spend a couple of evenings peeling it off, and you look for any positives that you can find. And in this case, it actually gave me an opportunity to go in a slightly different direction with the model. So I'd already decided that the blue for those crystals wasn't really the best thing for me. It wasn't kind of how I wanted to go. So after a fair amount of work, I building back up the base coats and the repriming and the base coats and various bits of varnishing. You can see that I've moved away from the blue crystals and actually gone for a green. So the way that I did this was I zenithal highlighted very carefully, and you can see the dark. There's a much darker tone to various bits of the crystals from the underside, and I used turquoise ink over the top. So this captured that zenithal highlighting much better. And you can actually mix these inks with grey paints. I've got a variety of Vallejo Game Air paints. Actually, these are model airs, and they've got a lot of greys, different grey colours in them. And you can mix the ink with those to match the colours that naturally occurred when you put the ink over your zenithal highlighting. So essentially, if you want a tinted grey or a tinted black, you can create those. So this is just the first pass, really. I was just wanting to see if I was going to be happy with the way these colours work through. I mean, one of the issues is trying to decide, well, okay, so if these crystals are green, the crystals protruding from the body, what other bits of the model should be green? So this is really quite a large model, and the temptation is to use lots of different colours, which can look a bit of a mess. So I was trying to keep to as few colours as possible, but if you can see the teeth there, I did those in green, and I wasn't really happy with how they looked. And if you remember at the beginning, these teeth are supposed to be bone. So I do change that in a moment. Because the upper teeth there are bone. The other thing that I've done here is that I've been much more careful with the blue paint that I used for the flesh. I watered it down a lot more. It was much more of a wash over the zenithal highlighting, and then I've used additional washes. So I've used red washes and flesh washes to try and pick out the veins in the arms, which was one thing I thought they did really well in the Privateer Press painted version. They really had a nice coloration. It felt like it's blue with some reddish pink tinges around the hands and feet and the areas where there would be more blood. So I've done a bit of that here. I mean, the camera image really pulls the colour out a bit more than it is in real life, but I think that worked quite well. And I also reflected that colour in the gums and the tongue. So I'm fairly happy now that I've got a generally blue model, some neutral browns and bone for the pelt around his waist, and then the green that will be reflected on his back under the arms where the crystals are shooting out. And he's got those all over the body, and those will be quite distinct. And then there's bits of pinky red that are dotted around, just to give a slight tonal variation, essentially, to the. So here you can see I've changed from the green teeth to bone teeth, and I think that does look much better. And that reflects the bone used both in toenails and fingernails, which you can't see in this picture, but also the bones that hang off his belt normally, that I had to remove when I was doing all the washing. And actually removing those meant that it made it much easier for me to do dry brushing on the bare skin around his belt, and to work on that the details in there without having the bones getting in the way. So those were removed, and that was really quite useful, because it is such a big model. It's quite awkward to paint, when you're trying to work on the bear. I mean, the bear round his waist is the size of a normal model, and if you're not careful, you're trying to move the model around in your hand to get into all the nooks and crannies, and you're banging and crashing all the other bits that you've painted, and knocking the paint off there as well if you're not careful. So these are some of the ways that I've been challenged painting this model. But you can still see there's bits of green up around the teeth. So eventually I work on those. Here you can see how the fingernails match toenails and bone in the jaws, and I think that works quite nicely when you have an overall view of the model. That colour is reflected in Vince Venturella talks about colour triangles. Essentially, it creates points of interest in the hands, and that's not what the Privateer Press model does. They don't use the bone colour in the hands. I'll show that the way they painted it again at the end. So then I've done a bit more work here around the teeth. You can see that I've used the game ink sepia from Vallejo, which is a fantastic, rich, deep ink, and it really pulls out the surfaces and facets of those teeth. You can also see that I've worked on the ice coming down between the teeth and brought that up to a much whiter colour, shaded with blue, to reflect partly the snow on the shoulders, but also distinguish it from the green crystal. So the way I've painted it, I've made these crystals more as kind of protruding, sort of energetic type protrusions that I don't know, they could almost have some magical basis, or they make the Glacier King stronger in some way, or they could just be a nice green sort of ice. I've got a picture of some green ice later, so I think it distinguishes it from that anyway, rather than the ice the ice around its jaws are actually just presumably frozen saliva or something like that. So that's just should just be white and blue. So you can see I've struggled to take pictures of the whole of this. I can either fit in the hands, but not the height of the green crystals, or I can take a vertical shot where I get the green crystals in and you don't see the hands. So here I've worked a bit more on the green crystals protruding down from the hands, and this was tricky because I know some people have painted those much more as sort of stalactite crystals coming down from the arms, but I think they're protruding from the skin there, so they should be green as well. And actually, in terms of where the colour comes, I think that actually balances across the model quite well. I've also did a bit more select airbrushing, just to really pull out the muscles on the arms, to highlight those up a bit, and I've done a few more washes to pull out the details, the depths, and so I may need to do a bit more of that still. It just takes quite a long time because it's such a big model. So here I've just about managed to fit the whole model in. But in order to paint this, you can see that I've actually had it sat on this box. So I've made holes in it. I've pinned big, thick paper clips up through the feet, and they pop down into this hollow box. And so to paint it, I've had to be shuffling this around. It's such a heavy model, though. The holes in the box keep getting bigger, and then it almost tips over. So then I have to put it in new holes. I've used cork sometimes to try and hold it in place, but it can get a bit unwieldy with it on this box as well. So sometimes you just need to hold it in your hand. So that's certainly been a challenge, painting this big model, trying to do detailed work all around the snow there, where the snow meets the green. It's really quite fiddly to get in those gaps, and holding such a big model makes it quite difficult to maneuver it around, actually see where you need to paint. So the big thing that is the basing. So I've been maneuvering it around on this box. So what should the base look like for such a big model? It should be interesting, and you can see here the way the light shines through this ice. It's really quite dramatic. For something like a glacier, these are the sorts of colours you get. There's whites and blues, but also you get all the greys from the rocks that have been worn away. Excuse me. So here is the Glacier King on the base that I made. So this is built up in a few layers. There's some bits of wood under here, which was the scaffold, and then I used some plaster, some clay, which I thought would crack in quite a nice way to produce realistic looking gaps. And then the clay was the main base that I sculpted over the top of the wood, and then the protruding bits of what looked like ice or rock. Those are some old bits of plaster that I had from filling some holes in the house, that I didn't need, that have nice textures and shapes. So you can see that I've tried to use a variety of different blues and whites to try and match in with the Glacier King, but without making the whole lot look far too blue. So hopefully it matches a bit the ice coming down from the jaws. And here's a lower level shot, so you can see the way I've tried to sculpt the edge of the base to make it look a bit like the front of a glacier. So that there are bits of cork in there as well to allow the Glacier King to slot in, and I've built up the back is actually much more rocky. So, and I'm hoping that rock will match in better with the rest of the models in this army, because currently they don't have any snow or ice on their bases at all. So here are a couple of sharper images of the Glacier King from two different directions, and you can see I've tried to make a deeper blue in the middle of the base, just to get a feeling of depth in there, that this is a deep ice down, that goes down deep, and then there's a lighter section in the middle to reflect off. I'm thinking of drawing painting on some ice cracks, and also adding some snow to the base as well, which will match the snow on his shoulders, but also match his rules, the fact that he creates this snowfall and ice all around him. So he's still not finished. He's a big model. I've still got to do work on the snow on his shoulders. The problem is it's very white, and the camera doesn't really pull out the differentiation very much. But there's so many strong shadows already, real shadows. It's quite hard to know the extent to which I should mimic those, and create grey areas in the snow that actually dull down the white, and the extent to which I just leave the light naturally to shadow the snow. So at the moment I've done a few grey washes and black washes around the edges to sort of enhance the shadows. But if you're not careful, the snow ends up just looking a sort of dirty black colour. So I'm still working on the snow in the shoulders, and of course I'll need to add the snow to the base. And what's also missing are the bones, which I've attached the front bones, but I've used a resin type glue this time. Last time it was a super glue, and they all just popped off very easily. So yeah, I'm having to glue that in a couple of sessions, and it takes overnight to dry, unfortunately. So those bones will be on there, and then the model will actually be all complete together, and then I can think a bit more about adding snow to the base. Anyway, so hopefully you can see in this image the way that I've used some of the ideas from the Privateer Press painted model, but done my own take on it really. I've used the bone colour more widely in the fingers and the feet, and I've also changed the colour of those crystals to be green, and I really like the way that colour balance works. But do let me know what you think. Please comment and say if you have got any suggestions for ways that this can improve. As I say, it's still a work in progress, and I do hope to finish it sometime this year. For watching, and see you next time.